You know, when we think of someone going no contact, especially in the context of an avoidant personality, our natural assumption might be that the silence hits them hard, that it forces them to confront the absence, the loss, the reality of separation. But here's something that might surprise you. One of the first things an avoidant hopes for when you go no contact is space, not just space, but space without having to explain themselves. That's the sweet spot for an avoidant. They often don't want the confrontation, the emotional unpacking, the vulnerability that comes with real accountability. No contact can actually feel like relief, and it's not that they don't care. That's a common misunderstanding. It's that caring deeply is tangled with fear, discomfort, and a sense of emotional overload. So, when you step away and the phone doesn't ring, when the text messages stop, when there's no more pressure to engage or respond or clarify, an avoidant can actually breathe easier. That moment right there is what they've been hoping for, not necessarily the end of the relationship, but a pause button on all the emotional intensity. Think about it. If you've ever been in a dynamic with an avoidant, you've probably felt that emotional pull where 1 minute there's connection and the next minute cold distance. That's not random. It's their nervous system responding to perceived emotional threat. The closer you get, the more vulnerable they feel. So in many ways, when you walk away or go no contact, what they hope, at least at first, is that it gives them freedom from emotional demand without having to be the one to cause a scene. They didn't have to explain. They didn't have to own their fear. They didn't have to navigate your disappointment. You did the hard part for them, but there's a twist. See, in that silence, they're not necessarily celebrating your absence. It's not that they're throwing a party because you're gone. It's more like they're sinking into the stillness, relieved that they don't have to confront the messy parts of connection. They're hoping the storm passed and that they didn't have to stand in the rain with you. For them, the storm is always the intimacy. It's not about arguing or conflict or incompatibility. It's about the rawness that comes with being seen, known, emotionally exposed. That's the storm they dread. So when you go no contact, they may not chase you, and that hurts. But it's not always because you meant nothing to them. It's often because they were already hoping for something that looked a lot like silence, not necessarily permanent silence, but just enough quiet for them to feel safe again. Safe from needing to change, safe from vulnerability, safe from the risk of being hurt or hurting you. It's a form of emotional self-preservation. Some might even say it's a form of quiet control. They don't have to raise their voice. They don't have to set boundaries in overt ways. Your decision to step away takes care of that for them. It protects them from the emotional confrontation they're trying to avoid in the first place. So their hope is simple. Let the silence stretch long enough for the emotional air to clear, not necessarily to fix things, but to reset the emotional playing field entirely. If they do think about reconnection, it's often with this unspoken condition: let's not talk about what hurt, let's not go deep, let's just go back to how things were when the emotional stakes were lower. But here's the thing. That kind of emotional avoidance can't build anything lasting. It's a temporary relief, but not a long-term solution. Silence doesn't solve the root issues, it just pushes them underground. And while they're hoping for peace, what they often get is a slow erosion of trust and connection. Because eventually, one person gets tired of doing all the emotional heavy lifting. One person realizes that space without accountability isn't love, it's escape. And love doesn't grow in escape, and that's why this matters, because while the avoidant may hope for space without accountability, what they truly need, even if they don't realize, it is the courage to face what space can't heal. Let's talk about something that's quietly sitting in the back of many avoidants' minds when you go no contact. They hope, sometimes silently, sometimes stubbornly, that eventually you'll be the one to break the silence. That you'll be the one who reaches out, not because they don't care, but because they don't want to be the one to cross that emotional line first. The desire is there, but the fear is louder, so they wait, hoping you'll come to them. Now, from the outside, it looks like they've moved on. You don't hear from them. They don't ask how you are. They don't check in, and that silence can be deafening. But beneath it, behind all that calm exterior, there's often a subtle, lingering hope that you're still thinking about them. That maybe, just maybe, you're feeling what they're not saying out loud. They don't want to be the one to admit they miss you or that they're affected by the distance. That feels too vulnerable, but if you reach out, that's different, that's safe, that's on your terms, and that's what many avoidants are silently betting on. It's a strange place to be emotionally. On the one hand, they fear the very closeness they sometimes crave. On the other, they fear being left, forgotten, or dismissed. So, when you go no contact, it presses on both those fears at once, fear of intimacy and fear of abandonment. And instead of confronting either one, they often retreat into a kind of emotional waiting room. They're not leaning in, but they're not letting go either. They're stuck between hope and fear, and hope in this case takes the shape of you making the first move. It's not that they expect a big dramatic reunion. Often they're not even thinking that far ahead. What they're quietly wishing for is some kind of signal, a message, a like on a post, a text, anything that says you're still there, you still care. Because if you break the silence first, they don't have to risk rejection. They don't have to wonder if it's safe to come forward. Your action gives them a green light without them having to expose their own heart in the process. And let's be honest, for someone who struggles with vulnerability, that green light means everything. It's a way of reconnecting that doesn't ask them to carry the emotional risk. They're not bad people for thinking this way. They're scared people. They're people who may not have learned how to move toward connection without feeling overwhelmed by it. So they hope quietly, deeply, that you'll do the brave thing for them, that you'll carry the weight of the first move, that you'll go first so they don't have to. But here's the hard truth about that dynamic. It's not sustainable. Because what happens when one person is always expected to go first? What happens when love becomes a one-sided pursuit of emotional safety for the other person? That imbalance slowly wears you down. It teaches you that your needs come second, that your silence must always break before theirs does, and eventually that weight starts to feel like too much to carry. Avoidants may not say it out loud, but they often hope you'll relieve them of the burden of initiating connection. That way, they don't have to confront the part of themselves that avoids intimacy, not out of indifference, but out of fear. But if all they ever do is wait for you to close the gap, what they're really hoping for is a relationship that doesn't challenge them to grow. And relationships don't work like that, not real ones, not healthy ones. So yes, when you go no contact, a part of them may be hoping, even expecting, that you'll eventually reach out. But what they're not always ready to face is what your silence actually means, that maybe this time you won't. There's something that doesn't get talked about enough when it comes to avoidant behavior, especially in the context of no contact, and that's control. When someone with avoidant tendencies watches you step back, go quiet, disappear from the daily rhythm of their life, something unexpected happens inside them. Yes, part of them feels relief from the emotional intensity, but there's another part, the part that's still watching, still waiting, that begins to wonder if this is their moment to regain control. Now, control for an avoidant isn't about domination or manipulation in some obvious, aggressive way. It's much more subtle than that. It's about emotional positioning. It's about being the one who doesn't need as much, doesn't ask as much, and definitely doesn't feel as much, at least not openly. So when you go no contact and they didn't initiate it, that balance shifts. All of a sudden, they're not the one who created distance, you did. and in their world that reversal can be unsettling. They're used to being the one who decides how close is too close. They set the pace. They determine when it's time to check in or pull away, but when you go quiet, that power dynamic flips. They're no longer the one in the driver's seat. They don't know where you are emotionally. They don't know what you're thinking, or worse, if you're thinking about them at all. That uncertainty, that loss of control, can start to create discomfort they're not equipped to handle. And yet, what they often hope for in that silence isn't necessarily for you to come running back with answers. What they're really hoping is that the silence becomes an opportunity for them to re-establish control over the situation, not by reaching out, but by mentally rewriting the story in a way that makes them feel less vulnerable. They'll tell themselves that you needed space, that it's probably better this way, that maybe you were too emotional, too demanding, too inconsistent. It's a kind of self-soothing one that lets them stay distant while still feeling like they're holding the reins. But let me tell you something, this illusion of control, it's fragile, because eventually that silence starts asking questions they can't answer, not with logic and not with distance. Questions like, if they didn't care, why does it still feel like something's missing? If this space was supposed to bring peace, why does it feel so uneasy? And here's the kicker, those questions don't get answered by maintaining control. They only get louder. And that's when an avoidant starts to feel the cost of the very thing they once hoped for. It's easy to underestimate how much avoidants crave safety, not just physical or situational safety, but emotional safety, and for them, control is safety. If they can predict your moves, if they can keep the dynamic on their terms, they feel secure. But real relationships aren't built on predictability. They're built on mutual vulnerability, on mutual movement toward each other. So when you break that pattern by going no contact and you don't return to the old rhythm, they start to realize they're not the ones leading anymore, and that can shake their foundation. The hard truth is that avoidants often hope your silence becomes an opportunity for them to regain emotional leverage, to settle into the comfort of not being the one who wants more. But what they rarely expect, and what ultimately challenges their world, is when you don't return, not because you're playing a game, but because you've outgrown the need to chase stability in someone else's hands. And that's when the real shift happens. That's when the control they thought they had begins to slip through their fingers, and they're left to reckon with the fact that someone who once moved around their edges has learned how to stand still without them. And that, right there, is what they never planned for. When someone with avoidant tendencies experiences no contact, one of the quiet hopes they carry, and it's not always conscious, is that time will do what they can. That time will help you forget the emotional depth of the connection, that the intensity of the feelings, the memories, the hard conversations, the vulnerability you both touched will all fade into something less sharp, less raw, and easier to avoid. Because for an avoidant, emotional depth often feels dangerous. It feels like a trap they weren't prepared to fall into. So when you walk away, when you go silent, what they often hope is that this silence will slowly erase the very part of the connection that made them uncomfortable in the first place. They don't necessarily want to lose you. They want to lose the emotional weight you carry with you. The expectations, the closeness, the truth, telling, the way you noticed what others didn't. They hope the time apart will soften your memory of those intense moments, that maybe you'll forget how much you once needed from them, or how deeply you once saw into them, because if you forget, they don't have to explain why they couldn't meet you there. They don't have to feel ashamed for backing away from what they actually wanted, but didn't know how to hold. You see, emotional intimacy feels threatening to someone with an avoidant pattern, not because it's inherently bad, but because it requires something they've spent most of their life protecting, their vulnerability. Being seen, being known, being affected by another person, that's territory that feels unpredictable, and unpredictable means unsafe. So when you go quiet, part of them hopes you're healing, yes, but another part hopes you're forgetting. Not just forgetting them, forgetting the version of them you met when they let their guard down. They want a reset, but not just in the relationship dynamic. They want a reset in your memory. A way to rewrite the story so that if and when you return, things can pick up again, but without the same emotional closeness, without the same stakes, without the same intensity that once made them feel exposed. And that's the thing, when you were close, you probably saw pieces of them they don't let most people see. Maybe it was in how they opened up late at night when their guard was down, or how they reacted when they thought you might leave, or how they suddenly shut down the moment things felt too real. Those pieces weren't just inconvenient for them, they were threatening, because they revealed something they weren't ready to confront in themselves. So when you go no contact, part of the relief they feel is tied to the hope that those moments won't define how you see them forever, that maybe time will distort the memory just enough to let them feel less exposed. But here's the thing, emotional depth isn't something you can forget if it mattered. It lingers, it leaves echoes, and while they might be hoping you're slowly detaching from that depth, what they don't realize is that your silence doesn't mean your heart has gone quiet. It means you're honoring the weight of that connection in a new way without begging them to do the same, and that's what they don't count on. They hope time will turn your memories into something dull, distant, easier to carry. But more often than not, time doesn't erase depth, it reveals who can handle it and who can't. And while they may be hoping you forget what it felt like to love them deeply, what they never expect is that you'll remember and still choose to walk away anyway. One of the lesser seen sides of avoidant behavior is this quiet underlying hope that no contact will somehow serve as a reset button. Like maybe if enough time passes, things won't feel as complicated. Maybe if the silence lingers long enough, when and if you two speak again, it'll be like rewinding the tape back to when things felt easier, lighter, less demanding. For avoidance, that reset fantasy is powerful. It's not about fixing what went wrong. It's about bypassing the part of the relationship that made them feel overwhelmed in the first place. See, to an avoidant, emotional closeness can feel like a pressure cooker. Even when things are good, the intimacy, the responsibility, the vulnerability, the emotional honesty, it all starts to feel heavy. And the more they feel that weight, the more they look for the exit, or at least for some distance. So when you go no contact, they don't always experience it the way someone with a secure or even anxious attachment style might. They don't immediately panic. Instead, they often think, okay, maybe this is what we needed. Maybe this break will give us a clean slate. But their version of a clean slate is different. It's not about coming back stronger. It's not about working through issues. It's about returning to a time when the emotional stakes were lower, when things felt more casual, more in their comfort zone. They're not hoping for healing. They're hoping for rewinding. That's what makes the idea of a reset so attractive to them. It gives them the illusion of starting over without having to acknowledge or unpack the part of the relationship where things got real. In their mind, the reset looks something like this. You reconnect, but you don't bring up the hard conversations. You don't revisit the times they withdrew. You don't ask for clarity or accountability. You just ease back into each other's lives with a kind of unspoken agreement. Let's pretend none of that happened. Let's keep it light this time. Let's not go too deep. Now, on the surface, that might seem harmless. After all, who wouldn't want to start over when things get complicated? But the danger in that kind of reset is that it doesn't actually change anything. It just delays the next rupture. Because if you come back together without addressing why things fell apart in the first place, you're not starting over, you're hitting pause on a problem that's still waiting to play out. Avoidants often hope that your silence will mean you're letting go of the emotional tension, that you've cooled off, that you've come to see things from their perspective, which usually means less pressure, fewer emotional demands, and more space to breathe. They hope you'll come back with softened expectations, with a willingness to accept them on their terms. And if you do reach out, they'll likely interpret that as proof that the emotional reset has worked, that the storm has passed, and now they can re-enter the relationship without fear of being pulled back into emotional territory they never wanted to navigate. But here's where things get tricky. You're not the same person after going no contact. You've changed, you've processed, you've sat with the silence and come to your own truths. So when you come back, if you do, it's not to go backward, it's to move forward with clarity and boundaries. And that's the part the avoidant often doesn't anticipate. They expected the slate to be wiped clean. What they didn't expect is that your version of healing might look like no longer tolerating emotional avoidance at all. And that's the real heartbreak for them, not just losing you, but realizing the only way to truly reconnect would require something they've spent a lifetime avoiding: emotional growth. So while they may quietly hope that time apart resets everything, what they're not prepared for is the possibility that time has only made you more certain of what you won't return to. Sometimes when we talk about avoidance and no contact, we focus so much on what they don't say, what they don't do, what they won't face. But what gets missed is that deep down, many avoidants are hoping, even if they'd never admit it, that the distance will somehow take away the responsibility they felt in the relationship. They're not just hoping you'll forget the closeness or reset the dynamic. They're hoping the silence will rewrite the narrative, that maybe over time you'll start to believe the disconnection was mutual, that you'll start questioning yourself, that your memories will blur just enough for the weight of what happened to shift entirely away from them. For someone with avoidant tendencies, emotional accountability is often a hard pill to swallow. Not because they don't know they hurt you, they usually do, but owning that, really sitting with the idea that their withdrawal, their silence, their inconsistency caused pain is deeply uncomfortable. It touches the very fear they've worked so hard to outrun, the fear that they are incapable of meeting someone emotionally. So what they often hope for during no contact is a kind of emotional erasure. Not just a break, but a rewrite. One where they're not the one who pulled away or shut down or sabotaged the connection. One where the blame feels less sharp and less focused on them. They want the silence to do the heavy lifting for them, to blur the edges of the truth just enough that if you ever come back, you're no longer standing on solid ground. Maybe you're unsure, maybe you think maybe I was asking too much, or maybe they just weren't ready. That ambiguity is exactly what they hope for. Because if you start questioning your own experience, they never have to face it themselves, and this isn't always calculated or cruel. Most of the time, it's protective. Avoidants often carry deep shame beneath their detachment. Shame for not showing up, shame for shutting down, shame for not being able to hold space for someone else's feelings, especially when those feelings reflect back their own emotional limitations. So they hope the time apart will do what they don't know how to do directly, make the discomfort disappear. They might even convince themselves that things ended because you were too emotional, or the timing wasn't right, or the connection just fizzled out. But what they're really doing is rewriting the story in a way that keeps them from confronting the emotional depth they weren't ready to meet. And when they hope you'll do the same, when they hope your silence becomes complicity, it's because that lets them stay comfortable in a version of events where no one has to look too closely. But the thing is, no contact has a way of sharpening the truth, not dulling it. When you're out of the fog, when you're no longer tangled in emotional back and forth, you begin to see things clearly. You start to recognize the moments where you made excuses, where you ignored your own needs, where you accepted breadcrumbs and called it connection. And once you see those things, you can't unsee them. You can forgive, but you don't forget in the way they hope you will. So while they're hoping you'll forget the weight of what really happened, while they're quietly relieved at the idea that maybe you'll both move on without needing to talk about the past, what they don't expect is that the silence actually made you stronger, that it gave you the clarity they were hoping you'd never find. Avoidants often want to escape the emotional cost of their own avoidance. They hope the distance will clean the slate without the messiness of real reflection. But what they never count on is this: sometimes silence doesn't erase the truth, it reveals it.